debate today is on this motion. This House believes that government should do more to end this depression, not on Keynes versus Hyde. But just so we anchor there. And so with that, we'll have 4 minutes each. The proponent starts.
Dr. Wong.
Ladies, gentlemen, Team Austria, as a token non-economist, much like my colleague, Mr. Gold Standard Parry, I get the honor and privilege to address this fine group of curious intellectuals. First, amongst the team featuring the only actual economic practitioner, Sean, the King of Norway, Anders Gunders, or whatever that is. Since Sean did such a great job summarizing Keynes, and Bryce talked a little bit about how I'll do my best to skip the baseline economics here. I will accept points of order, but any attempt to embarrass me and expose how little I know about this subject, I will Facebook the shit out of you. But I digress. Our stance is simple. Governments matter and can and should influence economies during times of market destabilization such as these. As a reminder of the history that Sean had just reviewed for us, Keynes came up with this idea during times when government debt was already low and we were in a prolonged depression. It entered us into a vicious cycle. There were lost jobs, lost purchasing power, and that aggregate demand continued to shrink and shrink. Why was that a vicious cycle? As that aggregate demand continues to shrink, output, as expected, continues to reduce. You need less workers, lay workers off, their purchasing power reduces, the cycle continues and continues, and as we keep waiting for this magical time to pick up, it just doesn't happen. By temporarily filling the void of private investment and propping up demand, again, like Sean mentioned, temporarily, we increase production. By extension, we increase wages that go to the workers, who are also the consumers, and we now have broken the cycle, that vicious cycle. We enter a virtuous cycle, production and growth, and continue. Now, a few points similar to what Sean mentioned about what Keynes is and what Keynesian isn't. So, first, I think very clear, Keynes suggested that we run deficits during bust cycles. He'd be very concerned about the use of spending, government borrowing during these boom cycles. And so at no point would anyone say that it's Keynesian to run deficits at all times. Secondly, Keynesians, again, I didn't even know I was a Keynesian until last week. Thanks, Dan. We're not against the concept of thrift. Again, for those who are in macro, we have seen the solo growth model. We understand how savings and accumulation do lead to progress. We just acknowledge the dangers of excessive savings. So be warned, my friends who were busy Wikipediaing economic growth this afternoon will say things like, governments don't know how to rein in their spending. They will compare to a household that needs to tighten their belt, live within their means, and yet we start to wonder, is a household really the right comparison for a nation state? 1 minute? Is it really the comparison for a nation state that can borrow, print money, and tax its people? I think we should all just roll our eyes if we hear any comparisons to a household. To conclude, somewhere around here, our Hayekian fringe economists would have us weather this storm with a status quo, do nothing prescription, or even better, do less, refusing to provide short-term confidence to the markets with the risk not of failed households, but of failed nation states. Bank runs, Lord of the Flies shit. I mean, in 2008, in 2008, after Bear Stearns had been sold, Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy, the Philadelphia Phillies were winning the World Series. I mean, this is a time of great uncertainty. Where, if you recall, basic day-to-day operations of healthy businesses were suffering. Our pontificators would love to just run a great experiment like Sean said. They would let the banking system collapse just to prove if their theories were right. Frankly, we do not believe so. Thank you for your time. Let's go Blues. If you have any questions, ask these two guys.
All right, But let's talk about the actual costs of stimulus. Team Keynes, or perhaps Team Mustache over here, would have you believe that that whatever my train of thought was, I just lost. No. Would have you believe that following Austrian policy is a grand experiment that we simply can't afford. The fact is we're in a grand experiment no matter how you look at it. We've never been in a world with debt levels this high, with monetary easing of the type that we have. No matter what we do, it's an experiment. We are in uncharted waters. So let's talk about the actual costs of stimulus. I've already mentioned the fact that government intervention, including through stimulus, breeds uncertainty, limiting long-term investment and hurting growth. But what are the more direct costs? If a government stimulates, it either has to borrow the money or tax. We all know that if the government borrows, it's not likely to cut back in the future. To quote Milton Friedman, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program. So let's talk taxes. And the evidence on taxes is pretty clear. Every dollar taxed reduces GDP by about $2. Estimates put the actual figure between 40 cents per dollar and $3.50, but the average comes out about $2.50, and no one argues it's neutral. So let's be charitable and assume it's $2 of GDP lost, $2 of income lost for every dollar taxed. That means that for every dollar the government spends in stimulus, you need at least a Keynesian multiplier of 2 just to justify the original stimulus. So what does the evidence say? The evidence is that in the 3 to 5 quarters following a stimulus, you do get an economic boost. Somewhere around the 3 to 5 quarter mark, though, the effect turns negative. And by the time you get 8 to 10 quarters out from the original stimulus, the estimates say you either have no net economic effect or a slightly negative one. That's a multiplier of 0, folks. I think the conclusion's pretty self-evident. But what of monetary policy? With all the talk of quantitative easing, surely monetary policy is better. Well, I've already explained the dangers of easy money in terms of creating bubbles and malinvestment. But let me reemphasize one point because it trumps all the others. Money isn't wealth. Wealth is production of what people demand. When you print more dollars, you have created a claim on the nation's wealth without producing something new. Each dollar you print decreases the amount each dollar in the system can purchase. What does this mean? It means that every person who has saved money has had a little piece of their wealth stolen from them. Every person who is frugal and chose to plan for their future is punished. And those who owe money, because that money will be worth less, are subsidized. Have no illusions. Quantitative easing is just wealth transfer. And the cruel irony is that not only are you stealing wealth from retirees and pensioners and endowments and parents saving to put their kids through college, but by artificially pushing down interest rates, you're further punishing them by preventing them from earning a reasonable return on the money they have saved. Monetary policy, like all government actions, is just picking winners and losers. And monetary stimulus is saying that those who have made bad choices and taken too much debt should win at the expense of those who didn't make the same bad choices and chose instead to save. That's not just bad economics, it's wrong.
First of all, Bryce, do you really mean that stimulating each other is bad?
Maybe not for you, Andrew.
Right, first of all, I want to thank you, Bryce, and thank Sean for giving excellent insight in the School of Weird Thoughts and the School of Economics. I certainly learned more from your talk than I did from spending 10 years at university learning economics. Dave, you certainly carried your weight, which is about half of mine. I won't bore you with too much of the economics, we've taken care of that, but I will share some secrets about the field of economics that might get me into the same kind of trouble that the Catholic that told the Pope that abstinence is a very good idea did. We're talking about social science. It's part of something bigger. It aims to explain how we as individuals, how businesses and nations interact. By using algebra and math, we manage to receive higher salaries than other people who try to do the same, like sociologists and anthropologists, who essentially do provide the same insight for less money. If they stopped wearing sandals and start wearing suits, we would be in trouble. A lot of you have heard from finance classes so throughout the year that it's part science and part art. That means that it's always art, it's not science. My argument is that we need government intervention based on societal needs more than the Keynes versus Hayek debate. I believe that the audience here deserve that this debate is elevated to a higher level, but I recognize that that might complicate things for you guys. In uncertain times, we need leaders. We look to them to do something. It's not what they do, that they actually do something. Uncertainty is scary, and we need someone to tell us what to do. If that is paying more taxes, so be it. The institutions that created the financial crisis, they were allowed to grow too big to fail because of the lack of government intervention. So after doing something very wrong, they tried to do something right by maintaining the institution, but by bailing these companies out. We had an interconnected system, and we needed them to stay in business.
Point of information?
Acknowledge?
Not despite government intervention. These institutions were allowed to become too big to fail because of government intervention. They set a precedent by bailing out Continental Illinois in 1984. They set a precedent by bailing out long-term capital management in 1997. It is a symbiotic relationship of financial institutions lobbying for special treatment from the government bureaucrats that you put so much faith in that has allowed this crisis to occur.
Thank you for your... Another important point is that we need to maintain the peace and to ensure that we have wealth distribution that doesn't instigate fights between groups of people that have more or less. Thank you. I propose the government leniency led to the fairly recent financial crisis, the euro crisis, the rise of the Russian oligarchs, and the re-emergence of centralized socialism in South America and Central America. Letting private interests roam freely may lead to increasing information asymmetries and potentially also social unrest. Finally, I want to make a point about easy to understand theories. The more education you receive, the more you go to school, the more you read, the longer you live, the smarter you get. Easy to understand theories are very popular among the Tea Party, people without education. And I believe that all of you here will see that an easy theory, like the Austrian School of Economics, is too easy for you guys. You're too smart. Thank you very much.
So I think it's necessary that I respond not to the group, but directly. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, this debate, as you know, goes well beyond economics, as you just mentioned. If I could start out by being a bit brazen and condensing the teachings of von Mises, von Hayek, and Milton Friedman into one key theme, it's this: that economic policy is inextricably linked to personal liberty. As central planning increases, your personal freedom and your personal liberty, by definition, gets crowded out. It's a concept deviously ignored by Anders and the rest of our comrades right here. They've tried to thrill and entice you with these wonderful theories like aggregate demand stimulation and multiplier effects. Worse, they pretend the current crisis in Europe is not the direct descendant of the policies they espouse here tonight. Policies of debt finance stimulus and deficit spending. 50 years of it in Europe. And where has it gotten us, I would ask? The policies that have debauched Europe's finances, debauched its human capital, and debauched the ingenuity of its citizenry. They're policies that promote dependency, mediocrity, and entitlement, and they have condemned a generation of Europeans to abject poverty, deprivation, and systemic unemployment rates that you guys have nothing to say about. Yet here we are. We're asked here again. After 50 years of this, all we need is one last government stimulus, one more temporary stimulus. It's like a teenager who suddenly discovered masturbation. He says to himself, oh, you know what, I'll just try this one last time. I think we all know how that story ends. Right? Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is sick, it is ill. It's like a wretched heroin addict. All right? And the last thing that they need, and it's the only thing you guys can give, is one more euphoria-inducing shot to the vein. Ladies and gentlemen, these are your drug dealers. They are indifferent to the long-term effects of the opiates that they are peddling today. Look, Aristotle told us that the paradox of human nature is this. The more people are given, the more they expect to receive. You want an example of this? Take the $800 billion stimulus in the United States 4 years ago. It was an ejaculation of entitlement expansion, Medicare expansion. It expanded the welfare state to put money into state and local governments. And here we stand. Unemployment rate is higher than when it was enacted. And Krugman, the Keynesians, and our acolytes right here are saying all we need is one more round, baby. One more round. Look. You vote for this motion, you are voting to let spoiled and pampered bureaucrats spend not your money. Your money's long been spent, but your children's money. And in the process, undermining the very important compact between present and future generations. The very essence of greed and moral depravity. I'd like to ask yourself one last question. Who would you entrust with this discretionary power? To wantonly spend your children's future money. A politician, a smug intellectual? We're in Great Britain right now. Perhaps the soon-to-be King Charles, you know, that little dilettante, the chinless, bad-eared man who has bad taste in women and reads poetry to vegetables. Of course not. We've had our enlightenment in this country. Let us remember what John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Adam Smith had to say. The lesson was that we must defend individual liberty because it's the one system under which immoral, stupid, mendacious, and pathetic bureaucrats can do the least amount of harm to each and every one of you. Listen, everybody, government has failed in its attempt to shape the process of human history. It's failed utterly. A vote for this motion is a vote for abject, pathetic, continued failure. Do not let your sails get swelled by the breezy sophistry of this pink Norwegian. I urge you to vote boldly against this motion in the name of your own personal dignity. Thank you.
So my point on this is going to be, this is an economic debate, right? I mean, I think what Evan displayed, what some of my other colleagues displayed, but I'm sure Michael displayed, is an emotional response to this issue. And that, I understand this is a very difficult issue. This is something that's affecting economies and people and jobs every day. And you know what? People believe strongly in things like liberty. People believe strongly in things like the philosophy undermining what type of government they want. People have ideological ideas about what they want to see from people running and from leadership, and that's important. But you know, we also got to make sure that we're not having emotion make these decisions. Okay? And the thing here, and the most important thing here, is what are the costs? Not do we like bailing out bankers? Nobody likes bailing out bankers. These people should be punished, right? Do we think this is fair? No. Sure.
That sounds pretty emotional.
Well, okay. Thanks. you'll have an opportunity to respond. No, what I'm saying here is, this is people's response to these issues. But what a Keynesian would say, or what kind of a stimulus argument is, let's set aside whether we like bailing out the banking system, and actually look at what are the costs and what are the benefits. I mean, that's what an economist brings to the table. All right? And so if we want to look at stimulus, so Bryce made some good points about the cost of fiscal stimulus, the cost of monetary stimulus. Well, one of the things that everyone likes to put out there when you're talking about fiscal stimulus is, borrowing money now is paying money back later. Actually, the really interesting thing is, so when debt to GDP was 150% after World War II, was that all paid off? Or did the economy just continue to grow at such a rate where that debt didn't really matter anymore, and the debt to GDP ratio just continued to decline over time? This is the core argument of stimulus, which is you're not just sure.
The one key point there is that the country did undergo effective austerity due to drastic reductions in war spending. That was not stimulus, that was austerity.
In 1947, after the debate. But what they did not do is run surpluses equal to the amount of debt that they incurred over the war. That's a very different thing. My point here is, what matters from the cost to an economy is not how much debt you run up, but what your debt to GDP is. It's your debt over the size of your economy. And if stimulus increases the size of your economy, then even if you add debt, the debt to GDP figure over time can stabilize and go down. And that's the key figure. So when you look at the United States in the 90s, they didn't pay off a lot of their surplus. They got, actually, under Clinton and under the Republicans at that time, they started paying it off. But the main reduction was a reduction in the debt to GDP. Similarly, on the monetary policy front, a big notion is inflationist theory. But, the notion here is inflation, central banks target an inflation rate of around 2%. And they deviate from that over time, certainly. But the costs of not having an active management, so the costs of deflation, particularly in the time in the early depression, where not prices weren't going up by 2 or 3%, but prices were going down because of the depressed state of the economy. In that situation, without an active central bank coming in to stimulate the economy, what was happening was a downward spiral of the price of something was going to be cheaper tomorrow. So what do? Do you invest in something? Do you buy something? Or do you keep money in your pocket? Well, if your money in your pocket is going to be worth more tomorrow, then you don't spend, and that creates a self-fulfilling cycle. So this is another example where the costs, again, are being overstated by our opponents, and in reality are much more affordable than they otherwise would be. So, okay, thank you.
I'm afraid for those of you, like Sean, expecting something emotional out of me, you're going to be sorely disappointed. I'm going to try and present our facts as clearly as possible and with as little emotion as possible, because I think the gravity of the situation, I agree, is severe. Our first proposal for government doing less to effectively end this recession is to end central banking. Central banking played a key cause in this huge depression. 40 years of unrestrained credit creation and interest rate manipulation, as Bryce has already gone into, have created bubble after bubble, whose bust has been consistently papered over with more and more debt. The world, as we've seen, as Bryce has already covered, we've never seen a world like today. And the idea that an Austrian solution would be any more of an experiment than the put one more shot of debt in their solution is a fallacy. We need to let interest rates work. We need to constrain credit and limit bubbles, and the most effective way, the two most effective ways I would suggest, is either a return to the gold standard, which would, at an additional benefit, curtail government's ability to mortgage your children's future, or free banking, where people in the free market decide what means of exchange they want to engage in. Our second solution would be to cut entitlement and social welfare provisions. These create perverse incentives to live off the state as much as possible, and even in the United States, a bastion formerly of free market capitalism, 50% of the population are now paying no taxes and are completely dependent on the state. It's very wasteful, poorly allocates capital, and most importantly, it crowds out social entrepreneurs like David Damberger, like Daniela Papi. I worked in a state school for 4 years. I was a teacher. Would I trust my own children to that? Never. Would I trust a social entrepreneur who had skin in the game, who was tailoring the service that I was looking for my children to suit their needs? Absolutely. That is the only service that I would want for them. Thirdly, we need to cut back on regulations and quasi-governmental organizations. They're enormously wasteful, they're incredibly prone to regulatory capture and lobbying, and they produce incredible friction in the wheels of commerce. Most importantly, if people are talking about fairness and what's good for the little man, they make it incredibly difficult for small businesses because they don't have huge compliance budgets and compliance departments to deal with 2,000 pages of financial regulations or 2,000 pages of FDA regulations. They don't have that. We need to allow them to dedicate their resources to what they do best, producing products and services that people want. Fourthly, we need to starve the beast, which is the only way to constrain government expenditure, by replacing the entire tax code with a 15% flat rate of consumption tax. Tinkering with the existing tax codes across the Western world would be impossible. There are too many vested interests. It would take too long. It would be incredibly complicated. Taxing consumption does a much better job of encouraging saving and investment in the real economy. And a flat tax means it's simple, cost-effective to administer, and far easier to plan. Hong Kong, which is where I'm from, no coincidence, has gone from basically a mud hut on the coast of China to one of the foremost financial centers in the world, has had the same tax code for 60 years. Flat income tax of 16% for 60 years. It has not changed. That allows for tremendous long-term planning and allows people to keep money in their pockets for the private economy. And finally, and this, I really reject this notion that this would be some crazy risk and that we need to just swallow the pill of bailing out banks. We need to allow banks to go into receivership. There is legislation existing in the United States to do this already. It wasn't enacted because of financial lobbyists and their cronies in the Fed and in the White House. Goldman Sachs and the Federal Reserve are a revolving door. We need to enact receivership laws. Shareholders who invested in banks who were benefiting from their reckless lending took risks. Let them take a bath. Creditors, if there's more money needed, they can take a bath in order of seniority. We need to keep these banks going as a going concern in case of deposit-taking banks to protect the everyman's deposits. But even then, if the shareholder money and the creditor money isn't enough, the exposure of the taxpayer will be far reduced than what we've done in this ridiculous situation of giving banks bailouts and keeping their shareholders and creditors completely untouched. In summary, I think we have made a strong case that governments must do less to end this recession now and put us back on a sustainable path to real prosperity. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you guys very much. Now we're going to open it up to the audience. You can put up your hand up and I'll select you. We'll first ask somebody if they want to debate on the side of the proponents. You have 2 minutes and I will strictly cut you off at 2 minutes, so make sure you stick to it. So arguing on the side of the proponents.
Well, can I ask a question for them to respond to?
Sure. No real rules.
Sure.
I think so.
To those who are proponents of more government stimulation, what do you say to what has happened? I mean, let's say the United States, President Obama has spent an egregious amount of money just in fiscal spending for programs, the bailout. I mean, as you mentioned, employment has never been higher. It's never been sustained at these high levels as it has for 3 years now, and nothing is working. So it's not a new idea that you have. I mean, this has been going on in the United States, and it's a disaster. So, what is your response to that?
I mean, the large argument going on in the United States is, they did the right thing. They stepped in, they put in a stimulus package, and it was not big enough. It offset so if you look at the expected unemployment rate, what things would have happened in absence of stimulus, you see a much higher, much more prolonged slump. The United States actually, if you look at it, has remember that chart of the UK where the economy is lower than it was 5 years ago? The United States, even though it's got a high unemployment rate, has grown beyond, has at least recovered from the dip. They aren't growing as fast as they should be. A lot of the things with the counteracting measures. So when they stimulated at the federal level, a lot of the balanced budget requirements, the collapse of tax revenues at the state level, did a reverse stimulus. So really undermined a lot of the stimulus. And also you have a congressional system that really tied everything up and tied the hands. So they could have had a much larger stimulus package. They could have done more on the monetary front. And that's ultimately the point here that we're trying to make.
Point of order. Sean made the point that models imply that things would have been much worse without the stimulus. Keep in mind that these models are Keynesian models based on Keynesian theories, which predicted that the stimulus would have us substantially better off than we actually are, based on the stimulus that was enacted, regardless of whether or not it should have been larger. So be sure to take that with a grain of salt. These are top-down models that don't take into account all of the issues with malinvestment and the disaggregation of the economy.
I'd like to let you guys sit down and have people in the audience not ask questions if you can and try and make their points. So that wasn't quite a point for the proponent. So I'll ask people, the proponent, to stand up if they'd like to make a point. If you were first.
Make a point to them.
You can stand up. Yeah, you have 2 minutes.
You guys talk about a lot about austerity, but none of you mentioned the term reform.
None of us mentioned austerity once.
Well, I've mentioned it in passing.
So you don't talk about reform. So for example, nobody says that Greece should not reduce its public sector. People recognize that it's a problem in Greece that people don't pay taxes, the public sector is too big. So there is a point of reform. But we see that the austerity in Greece has led to a reduction in the economy of 20%, which is obviously not helpful in the long term. So why is it that you're not talking about fundamental reform and the problem being more of a political problem rather than an economic problem?
We're not going to answer questions. This is debate.
Yeah,
We'll let you guys save all these and use them in your final rebuttal. All right. Now, would somebody like to speak on behalf of the opponents?
We're swimming up here, ill here, aren't we?
Mullin?
They said it too well.
We've made the
Come on,
case,
Gavin.
we've converted the whole group.
I want to have some questions, Bryce.
Yeah.
No, questions.
It's all questions.
David, can we just go, how many people would have questions if we were allowed to ask questions?
But here's the point, I think.
I'd like to, I will get to, I think we'll allow that to happen. I think we'll let people make their points if they want to make points. And then we'll move to the questions. Yeah. So other people would like to speak on behalf of the opponent's side. Next.
I just want to say thank you both for doing this. And one of the things you guys didn't approach was at the very beginning of this financial crisis, after Lehman fell. We recently had a banker come to speak yesterday for corporate valuation. He was speaking about Rio Tinto not being able to roll out his short-term debt, and if there was no bailout or if there was any other type of help from the government, companies as big and as well rated as Rio Tinto and others would have just gone bust. So the consequences of not doing anything would have been terrible. I get the theoretical point of view, and it's fine in theory, but in reality, if the government didn't step in when it did, the consequences of the financial crisis and liquidity crisis would have been awful.
Point of order?
Point of order, sorry.
Oh, please.
We just came from an M&A meeting
Yeah,
with the CFO of Rio Tinto, who was bailed out, or who got financing from China.
Yeah.
So,
But prior to that, he couldn't get any, first of all, he couldn't get any financing on the commercial paper, and because any other bank, so he recurred to desperate measures which were there, that one. But after that, the slow view came, you saw, and where he said, like, thankfully the markets recovered, and we didn't have to basically hand our company to other people, which would have been much worse. That was part of the stimulus. So.
Point of order? 2 things. 1, the government isn't in the business of deciding who should and should not end up owning a company. 2, the problem with the commercial paper market wasn't that we didn't have government intervention when we should have. The problem was that the laws didn't allow for receivership. Lehman Brothers was acting as a bank. When banks fail, the government should take them into receivership, as is normal for banks in the United States, in which case, whatever their operations are, continue functioning. The commercial paper market would have continued functioning. The problem with the commercial paper market was that when Lehman Brothers failed, they just stopped. Their operation just stopped instead of being taken into receivership, which created instantaneous counterparty risk that hadn't existed before. Secondly, when Bear Stearns failed, they got a bailout that Lehman Brothers didn't, which left everyone in the market not knowing who the hell was going to get money and who wasn't. That was the government creating uncertainty such that people could not know who would be backed and who wouldn't.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is, I'd still like to now make it still people who have questions. You can stand up and say your questions, but we're not going to let people to reply to them. We're just going to take questions from the audience and let people use that in their final rebuttal. Okay? But if somebody would like to speak, Prashant would do this.
I had one in opposition. So, just a quick one, really. Just maybe a thought. Isn't the problem essentially that the market and the system expects a bailout, and that's a structural issue, and that if they didn't expect a bailout and if it wasn't priced in, then you wouldn't have that issue. So it's a change in expectations is what's really required. That's just.
Okay. So anyone else who would like to make a point, or you can make a point through your question, we'll still allow a few more people. So I know Kenny had his hand up.
To Bryce's point, one of the things you mentioned is that there is uncertainty and that causes the problem. But wouldn't greater government intervention create that certainty that an action would be taken one or the other? So doesn't that in fact make a point that there should be greater government intervention? Because there is uncertainty, people don't know who's going to take charge. That could actually be a cause of the problem. And with greater intervention, you could actually fix that problem.
Only with
Bryce, sorry, I'm not going to want you no answering the questions. We're just going to let people ask the questions, and then we'll have another final rebuttals. Before?
How certain are we that if we pursue the Austrian approach, we're not going to go through the same bubble and bust cycle?
That's a question. Can I?
Nope. Nope. We're letting you guys. You have another questions? You got it. Joe, did you have one?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know that much, but I'm having a little trouble understanding. You're talking about banks going into receivership and allowing them to go into it. And I have trouble understanding what exactly happens after that. And I sort of jump straight to what David was saying, like Lord of the Flies scenario. Sure. And so I'd love to understand from not just a banking perspective, but like what's going on in people's minds, what is confidence, et cetera, et cetera. Walk me through that.
Sure.
Again?
Yeah, I think it's simplistic, easy, and naive to argue back and forth about whether we should have more government, bigger government, or less government, smaller government, when, at the risk of sounding cliche, we should have smarter government. So I'm curious, from both perspectives, if the government is going to act to end the depression, what do you believe are the right things for it to do? Is that infrastructure stimulus? Is that tax cuts? What are the right things as compared to just more things or less things?
Two more. Ben?
So my question was, my understanding of Keynesianism is that it requires governments to be responsible in the boom times, and that is politically impossible. So maybe comment on that.
Okay. And last one. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, on the same point actually. What would you tell Portuguese, Spanish, Irish, and Greek people, and now Cyprus as well, who just cannot have any access to debt anymore? So the question they should go. This has been that government should do more, but can they even do more? Is that even possible for them?
All right. So I'll let you guys kind of take like 2 minutes to huddle, and then we'll have 5-minute final statements from both sides.
Come on, guys.
Gracias.
final points. I'll remind both the debating teams and the audience that we are arguing the motion. This House believes that government should do more to end this depression. That is what we are going to vote on at the end of this. So first, the proponent.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of good questions. I'm going to do my best to touch on a few of them, but we'll be around afterwards if folks, because I mean I can't deal with all those all at once. Just to talk a bit about practicalities again of what we're talking about here. Maybe going to Gavin's question in particular. What are we talking about here? And it was interesting to me that it took until the third speaker on the opposing side to actually hear a bit of a concrete proposal of what the Austrians would actually do, because I think that's the right question. So what would they do? And what we heard, from Mike in particular, but I think others supported. Probably not Evan, because I think he supported the bailout. But I mean that's a whole different story. It is let's abandon the modern financial system. Let's go to the gold standard. Okay, this is a great idea. It was in place for a couple hundred years, but now some reason it was abandoned in the 30s. And now we should bring it back because that's a good way to get government out. And I mean, this is a good example of always using, whenever there's an imperfection out there, then you blame it on the government. And whether it's true or not, it's very convenient because it's very hard to falsify in a world where there's always government is there, right? So in a world with a gold standard where the supply of money has nothing to do with the size of the economy, it's basically how much gold is out there in the world. And again, you have situations where, in the past under the gold standard, incredible volatilities, huge booms and busts, all the way through the 1800s, all the way through the early 1900s, as the volatility in the economy, but also the volatility in the amount of money in the economy, which is not some rule or some kind of Milton Friedman-like monetary view, again, which I think Evan would support, is set by the amount of gold out there. And I think that just shows you, again, that we're not actually dealing with serious ideas here. We're actually dealing with issues that, old things that have been abandoned, things that we like to latch onto because it helps our point of view, but I don't think are realistic in the world that we're talking about right now. The other thing I just want to point out, in terms of specific things, Europe is a bit of a separate thing. I'm going to try and maybe get to it if we have time. But in the rest of the world, again, we're talking about situations where you don't have, the debt to GDP in the United States is high. It's not as high as it was in the 1930s, 1940s. You have situations where post-war economies got out and were able to pay down debt. And the point here again is not that it's not that it's fair, not that we're picking winners or losers. You may actually do that, but is it better to ideologically say, I'm not going to do that at all? Or is it better to say, you know what, overall, even if that's something I don't like to do, it's still going to make people better off in the aggregate, in the economy as a whole, and that's going to keep things going. Particular comments about Europe. I actually don't envy the people of Greece right now, obviously, but the point that they have there is it's not a standard Keynesian, it's not a standard Austrian situation in that they have a fixed exchange rate. I mean, they have effectively a gold standard here in Britain in that they do not control their currency. Their currency cannot adjust. It's set, and so they're stuck, and they're going to have to deal with, as Varun said, a 40%, some kind of turnover in their economy, and that's because they have no monetary policy at all. So what can you do there? I mean, you can say, if you're Greece, you can say, well, I can walk away. If you're Germany, you may want to flip it around and say, well, Germany can look and say, is this Euro project worth saving? Because when you look at a currency union, you should have a nation state that goes with it. And Europe, unfortunately, has a currency union and not a nation state. So without getting too much, so those are the details. To sum up, the costs of inaction, in my opinion, are too high. The costs of just saying, let's let this experiment play out. Let's let our Austrian ideas. Let's let let the bottom collapse and see what happens at this point in terms of years and years of recovery that will require unemployment, that, it means people's careers, it means entire lives, years without income. These are things that I don't think are worth taking an experiment on. And so in that sense, I don't think pursuing austerity, pursuing a reduction in government is important. At the very least, the government should not make things worse. So when you think about this argument, think about it from that perspective. And if the government has something in its hands to, on a cost-benefit analysis, can make it better off, then they should do it, because that's what we expect from leaders, that's what we expect from governments, and that's what I think we should all, as citizens, demand. So thank you very much. Please support the motion.
All right, well, I'd just like to address a couple of the questions directly, because we got several of them. Can the government add stability? Of course the government can add stability. The government can add stability by not changing the rules. The problem with October of 2008 was that the government picked institutions to bail out, picked institutions not to bail out. And the choices seemed arbitrary. Market participants, it made it impossible to judge the counterparty risk of other players. Yes, that could be solved by having consistent, well-defined rules that exist ahead of time that allow people to predict which firms will and won't fail, which ones will and won't receive bailouts. But how many times in your life have you known Democratic politicians to hold true to a single rule such as that? We're talking about practical solutions. We've talked a lot about theory, but in practice, how often have politicians actually held fast and steady to not spending extra money during good times, things of this nature, to not changing rules because we're in a crisis and they want us to do something. The simple idea, we have to do something, we must do something, breeds uncertainty. That's the fundamental issue. Has the Austrian experiment been tried? This was asked. This degree of Keynesianism has never been tried. No matter what we do, it hasn't been tried. But Austrianism has, to some extent, been tried. You look at Canada in the mid-90s, 1995, went through the exact same situation as the US and Europe have gone through now, roughly. The big difference was they committed themselves to balancing the budget in 2 years, / 60,000 federal employees, and we're back on the growth path in 3 years. Hong Kong, an Austrian paragon. Estonia went through the European crisis, internally devalued 50% their wages, but they're on a growth path now, and are engaging in productive investment, and are one of the most dynamic economies now in the Western world. To answer the question about receivership, the concept behind receivership is when a bank fails, instead of stopping operations, the government takes it into public receivership. It keeps running until the assets, the bank, can be sold off to a new institution. The depositors are protected to prevent bank runs. But ultimately, the shareholders lose all their money. The bondholders get paid in order of seniority based on the sale of the bank to whoever buys it. And the depositors and the people to whom they've loaned funds, the only thing they notice is that the logo changes in their statement. It doesn't create any... Oh, and management gets fired. Kind of important, since they're the ones who got the bank to fail in the first place. We certainly agree that the idea of smart government is important. And there are many things that a government can do that even Austrians will acknowledge are beneficial. The internet came from ARPANET, a government investment. The government can engage in these sort of long-term projects. The interstate highway system in the United States, no one will argue, didn't lower the cost of production and transportation for the entire country. There are things the government can do that are valid. Our point isn't that they can't. Our point is that the history says they don't. On average, do you trust governments to allocate funds efficiently? Or do you trust them to go throw $1 million bashes in Las Vegas? For those of you following that story. The point is, in a market, if people are unreasonably profligate, they lose their shirt, and they have a hard time getting employed the next time, except perhaps at the Federal Reserve. And as to... and as for what to tell the periphery. The problem with the periphery isn't that they're engaging in austerity. The problem with the periphery is that they're changing the rules so damn fast that no one can predict what's going on. We talk about the gold standard. The gold standard is not the only option. But the gold standard, or fixed currencies, is not why the euro has failed. The gold standard does not allow governments to engage in profligate behavior without being punished, without it eventually coming back to bite them in the ass, and that's what we're seeing in Greece, Portugal, and Spain. Governments that lived beyond their means and could have gotten away with it in a floating rate, printing money to steal money from savers to pay off their cronies. The gold standard prevents that. We don't have to go back to a gold standard. It would be nice in some ways. No currency risk, cross-border flows. We went off the gold standard, and we didn't get back to the same level of international trade until 1998 that we had been prior to World War I. That's insane. It took us 80 years to get back to the same level of international integration. Finally, to some of their points, to the degree of freedom, or sorry, ideology, don't like picking losers. It's not a matter of ideology. It's a matter of picking losers, picking winners and losers breeds bubbles and punishes those who invest intelligently. Let prices work. Let the market work. Vote against this motion.
All right, so before we do the final votes, let's give a huge round of applause for everyone. Two different votes, because one's for interest sake, one's for one is to see who you thought did a better job of debating the motion. The proponents or opponents, we'll do that here. That is, we're saying, wins the debate. Then we will go back to the intellectual exercise of how people shifted in their views, which is just for interest sake. So can you pass me the green pen there? So this is for who you think did a better job today in the debate. We'll do it this way. The opponents, these are the proponents. So hands up, and I know we've had a shifting of people, so this is definitely not statistically accurate. But people who thought that the proponents did a better job of arguing today's debate, hands up. And the people who thought that the opponents did a better job of...
You're too kind.
Easier. Lost the sex references.
I think we should have a different one for this mustache. No.
Congratulations to our winners! So now, just for interest's sake, where you actually lie in sort of your feelings on these issues, how many people now support the proponent side that the government should do more? Hands up.
So we didn't swing then.
We'll see, we don't know how many people left now in this game. And how many people support the opponents that the government should do?
So I think
ratios are about the same.
You may have swayed one person.
Yeah.
I think it's within statistics.
Within error of the amount of people left in K. All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for